was the human body found in a wooded area, wrapped in plastic.
We were dealing with a pretty gruesome scene.
You say the body was mutilated.
Our victim was missing the head, the hands, the feet.
Only a torso was found at the scene.
There's something depraved going on here. Why would any human being do this?
We have a sailor that's missing. It could be Conway.
After he was first reported missing, I saw his car leaving the base on 2 separate occasions.
Something was not right. He would not have given up his dream.
Things were beginning to not match up.
You had one person who had a fantasy of committing a murder and another who was the perfect puppet.
He had been convinced that he was out to get him and he had to strike first.
He got the players that he wanted, his victim, Conway, and the person to carry it out for him. He just took sick pleasure in being in control.
With so many homicides, there is a why. A jilted lover, a money issue, a rage of the moment. I mean, you can find a why. But there is that small subset of murderers who just are evil.
They wanted to commit the perfect murder, and he had the ability to persuade people to do what he liked for them to do.
This was the most horrific experience of my life. One of the most sickest, twisted individuals you could ever have the misfortune of meeting.
A quiet afternoon in rural Warner Robins, Georgia, is shattered when the Houston County Sheriff's Office receives a 911 call from a logging company.
There was a logging crew in the wooded area off Georgia Highway 96, and they had been in there for several days clearing timber. They noticed a smell that was unusual to them, a bad smell, what they believe may be an animal carcass. And as the crewman was looking around in the wooded area, he noticed some blanket material protruding from the dirt. We sent a patrol deputy to the scene. The carcass was not buried extremely deep. It was obvious that it was wrapped tightly in a blanket and some plastic and had duct tape wrapped around. They parted some of the material, and after just a few moments, I realized that it was a human body. They couldn't tell how long it was.
We knew fairly quickly that we were dealing with a pretty gruesome scene.
Not only was our victim missing his head, but also the hands and feet. So we brought a cadaver dog out to try to locate any items related to the death. But, of course, everything in the wooded area had been already disturbed by the logging crew. We had no results on those searches.
It was evident from what was not found that this was not the scene of the actual murder, that this was disposal.
Detectives transport the partially decomposed torso to the medical examiner's office, hoping an autopsy will reveal the identity of the victim and how they ended up in a shallow grave.
The initial autopsy medical examination revealed both feet had been removed just above the ankle, both hands had been removed at the wrist, and the head had been taken off at the base of the neck. Anytime you have a person intact, you have ways to identify them. You always had dental records, you certainly have fingerprints. In this case, the perpetrators were trying extremely hard to make identifying this victim impossible.
It may make identifying the body a difficult situation, but there's something even more depraved going on here.
The rectum had been cut out of the victim, the testicles had been removed, the penis had been skinned. You just can't wrap your mind around that.
It certainly raises questions, what was the context of this murder?
There was also a pattern on the thigh area. We just didn't know what could have caused this kind of mark. The medical examiner was not sure of the cause of death at that time because of the missing body parts. But we knew if we could make identification of this victim, we would have a better idea of where to go to find our suspect or suspects. Of course, we were able to determine white male, but we also had some idea of weight, height, hair color. So a lot of our focus was measuring the body, trying to get a determination of overall length, and the medical examiner was able to determine that our victim was approximately 6 foot tall, and the weight was estimated at approximately 185 pounds, between the ages of probably 18 and 25, based on the body. And the hair color would be a dark brown or black color. But one of the bigger finds, the medical examiner noted a 3 to 4 inch scar inside the left knee of our victim, which indicated this person had some medical procedure.
Now we had some information that we could begin to work with as far as identifying the body, and that would be that scar.
Detectives use the victim missing person cases.
We sent this information out to agencies, not just statewide in Georgia, but also nationwide. Immediately, we had other people coming in looking for their missing persons cases.
But unfortunately, none are a match for their unidentified victim. While detectives search for leads, news of the grisly murder quickly spreads through the small town of Warner Robins.
Any homicide in a community like this is going to get some press. This one got more than the fair share of it because of the nature of the killing.
You say the body was mutilated.
Found a partially buried body in a shallow grave in our county. Only a torso was found at the scene.
Right here in the local area, this case was the talk of everyone. Could this be a serial killer? Could this be a Satan-worshiping type thing? A cult-like activity?
Residents fear the killer could strike again, and detectives grow even more determined to quickly solve the case. A week into the investigation, with tensions running high, police receive a call from naval investigators on a base in Florida.
When we saw the bulletin, we reached out to Houston County Sheriff's Detective John Holland. Hey, we have a sailor that's missing that matches the description of the torso that you found. We're conducting our investigation in Pensacola regarding a missing person, Conway Utterbeck, and we thought it possibly could be Conway.
Coming up, investigators target a person of interest in Conway's disappearance.
He was in a position where he was able to take advantage of people underneath him.
The problem was he was no longer part of the Navy.
We didn't even know where he was. However, we had access to his puppet.
I recall him saying, you just try to live your life and then somebody gets in your head.
A week after a mutilated torso is found in Georgia, local authorities are contacted by a naval CIS unit in Florida. They think the remains may be a sailor that has been missing for 2 months, Conway Utterbeck.
Originally, we determined that it was a missing person case. There was nothing to cause us any suspicion that there was any foul play or anything amiss. At the time, we knew that on April 6, 1992, a day that the USS Forrestal was getting underway to go out to sea, Conway Utterbeck was officially declared in an unauthorized absence status. Unauthorized absence means that they failed to report is leaving to go out to sea.
When the USS Forrestal returned to port, roughly 2 weeks later, there was still no word from AWOL sailor Conway Utterbeck.
After the ship returned, the Judge Advocate General came to me and stated that Mrs. Utterbeck, the mother of Conway, had been calling and was very concerned that she had not heard from her son for approximately 3 weeks. It was just a mom's instinct. She knew something was wrong.
Whenever he was in the Navy, no matter where he was stationed on the ship or not, we heard from Conway at least every 10 days. I knew something was not right. I called the USS Forrestal and was told, oh, he's just a young sailor out spreading his wings. And I said, this is not him. From the time he could talk, he would tell us, when I get big, I'm going to go into the Navy. He would not have given up his dream that easy.
Reba informed naval investigators that she last heard from her son a few days before he failed to report duty.
I received a call from Conway. and he said, Mom, I'm going to go with a couple of my shipmates, and we're going to go to Georgia for a weekend. And I'll call you when I get back to the ship. Don't worry, Mom. I'm with friends. And that was the last I heard from him.
At the time of this incident, I was on board the USS Forrestal, and that's where Conway and myself worked as junior sailors. Honestly, Conway did not seem to be the guy that would have went AWOL. This was one of the greatest honors that he felt that he could do for his country.
We conducted a service record review of his time in the Navy, and there were no red flags, there were no incidents. He followed the chain of command, and he didn't get into any trouble. I conducted inquiries with Navy Federal Credit Union, which determined that Conway's bank account had not been touched for approximately 3 weeks, which was unusual. However, we believed that Conway was alive and well because his vehicle had been seen at different locations on the base.
2 or 3 weeks after the time that he was first reported missing, I saw his car leaving the base on 2 separate occasions. I honestly didn't think that anything untoward had happened to him.
At the same time, Warner Robins, Georgia, unbeknownst to us, had discovered a torso, but the torso was missing the head, hands, and feet. So they didn't, and it had the same characteristics of Conway, to include his approximate age, weight, and height. When we saw that, we reached out to Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
Have the 2 investigative teams been trying to solve the same mystery? To get answers, both sides agreed to join forces.
We gathered Conway's x-rays, and we had them transported to Houston County, but they could not make a positive identification just using the x-rays and the torso.
Fortunately, we got the height, weight, age, hair color of Conway Utterback, and the information matches our deceased victim. On top of that, we found out that Utterback had had a leg injury while he was in basic training and had surgical repair done to that leg. And we were able to match that scar with the scar on his torso that we had.
Primarily because of the scar that he had on his leg, we knew that we had Conway Utterback. He was not AWOL. This was actually a homicide.
Even without dental records, fingerprints, or a definitive cause of death, investigators are confident enough that the victim is Conway Utterback. They approach his family with the heartbreaking news.
The Navy personnel came to the house to inform us that Conway was dead. That day, I prayed to please help me get through this. Conway was my oldest child. Conway was very nice, thoughtful. He was very good at watching after his little brother and sister. We lived just a couple of blocks from a marina. That was Conway's biggest delight, to get to go with Dad down to the marina and ride on a boat. The day after he graduated from high school, he wanted me to take him to the nearest Navy recruiter. Conway came out of the recruiter's office an enlisted sailor. That was his dream.
Nothing really stood out that would say, Conway had an enemy. Conway had somebody that was really out to get him.
Following their conversation with Miss Utterback, detectives rushed to identify the friends who spent the weekend with Conway before he disappeared, hoping they saw or heard something that will point to his killer.
We mustered everyone up in the engineering department, which is where Conway was assigned. We determined that the last sailors that Conway had been known to be with were Edward Vollmer and Travis Henson. We felt that in order to find out what had happened,
the crew aboard the USS Forrestal have just named the 2 sailors who spent the weekend with Conway Utterback before his disappearance: Ed Vollmer and Travis Henson.
So Henson and Vollmer are questioned about his whereabouts, and they both provided similar accounts that they had traveled to Warner Robins, where Vollmer's parents lived, for the weekend.
It was nothing for a group of sailors to take a trip to Georgia. It gave everybody a break from the Pensacola area.
All three returned to Pensacola. Conway Utterback had asked them to drop him off at the Backseat Bar, which was a very popular bar in Pensacola that a lot of sailors went to. They dropped Conway off at the bar that night, and the two of them had returned to the ship without Conway.
Hitson and Vollmer claimed that is the last time they saw Utterback.
We went out to the Backseat Bar. We conducted interviews with the folks that worked there, and they stated that they believed Conway had been dropped off at the bar that night, but they could not positively identify him.
If Conway traveled back to Pensacola with his two friends, then how did his body end up in Warner Robins?
We were trying to make sense of it all. Things were beginning to not match up.
After obtaining conflicting reports about the last known whereabouts of Conway Utterback, investigators conduct a second round of interviews with his fellow sailors to learn more about Ed Vollmer and Travis Hitson.
We came up with a game plan, and the first folks that we interviewed were people who had befriended Travis. He used to babysit their kids. He really wanted to fit in and to kind of have a family.
I first met Travis Hitson when I first arrived to the USS Forrestal. Everybody lives in very close quarters while you're on board the ship. That particular lifestyle, you do forge very close bonds with your shipmates. So we became pretty good friends. On the ship, Travis did everything that was asked of him, and he worked as hard as anybody that I knew.
As a sailor, Travis Hitson was described as very easygoing, a little quiet, a little timid. Didn't seem like he had an aggressive personality. He was very eager to please. He followed the chain of command. In fact, the chain of command was extremely important to him.
But when he wasn't in uniform,
Life, and there was a fair amount of drinking involved when you're not on duty and off the ship.
The shipmates that we interviewed started noticing that he was drinking more and more, to the point of even, blacking out when he drank. He did stupid things. He wouldn't remember them.
One instance, he got really inebriated and wound up walking into the wrong apartment. The owners of the apartment called the police. Next thing you know, the police are there and they arrest him for breaking and entering. So that was a tough little time for Travis.
after building a profile of Hitson as a troubled sailor battling addiction, investigators wonder if his drinking had anything to do with Conway's disappearance. They then explore if Vollmer had similar skeletons in his closet.
And Vollmer's described as the group guy. I mean, he's with this group of friends. They all hung out together, partied together, worked together.
There was this group of sailors, and they would play these role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. But he was the alpha. As compared to Hitson, he would have been more of a leader.
He was described as being very smart, and as a sailor, Vollmer had actually been accepted to an elite nuclear program.
Conway, Travis, and myself, we were the junior sailors in the engineering department. And Ed Vollmer was our lead petty officer. When you're a junior sailor on board a ship, you always try to latch on to the more senior petty officers in charge. And plus, he had more life experience than the rest of us. He had already been married, already had a child. So it was easy for us to look up to Ed.
But as interviews progress, investigators discover that not everyone aboard the USS Forrestal shared this same admiration.
There were a few shipmates that believed that Vollmer thought he was smarter than everyone else. You know, he had a very arrogant personality, and some people were scared of him. His personality was just clashing with other people on the ship.
It's still in the realm of possibility that Vollmer dropped Utterback off at a local bar down in Florida. But once we found out about Vollmer's personality, Our investigators were beginning to focus more and more on the weekend in Vollmer's parents' home. Did they have any altercations or anything like that?
Investigators then request a second sit-down with Vollmer.
The problem was that Vollmer was not there. He was no longer part of the Navy.
Ed Vollmer had just gotten discharged from the Navy he was still in Pensacola, living off base at someone's house.
Working off a hunch that Vollmer knows more about Conway's disappearance than he's let on, authorities attempt to confirm his location without tipping him off.
We had set up a surveillance on this location and on Vollmer's car. Unfortunately, they missed the car leaving that residence, so Vollmer left the area prior to us being able to bring him in for questioning.
We knew, in all likelihood, he was returning to his family home in Houston County. We immediately ordered a couple of investigators to set up surveillance on Vollmer's home, and we were in hopes that Ed Vollmer would show up.
At the very least, Mr. Vollmer had some explaining to do, because the idea we had at the time was 3 sailors come to Houston County, and very possibly only 2 returned to Pensacola.
Ed Vollmer, a person of interest in the murder of Conway Utterbeck, has just gone missing after being discharged from the Navy.
Ed Vollmer had gotten discharged from the Navy for possession of marijuana, and we didn't even know where he was. However, Travis Hitson was still on board the USS Forstall, so we had access to him.
Investigators sit down with their second person of interest, hoping to learn more about Conway's death.
When we sat down with Travis Hitson, the entire goal is first just to get Hitson talking about the case. At this time, we don't know what may have drove this particular homicide.
When Travis Hitson joined us in the room, he was visibly nervous compared to the first time. He looked like he was overwhelmed.
You can just tell when he sat down. He really had something on him he wanted to talk about.
We started going through what we had already discussed with him, which was the weekend in question.
Hitson reiterated what he had said before, that Utterbeck went with him over the weekend up to Vollmer's parents. They hung out, and then they came back and they dropped Utterbeck off at a local bar, and that was the last that they saw of him.
But Hitson's demeanor leads investigators to suspect that there is more to the story than he's letting on.
We told Hitson, it's obvious just from looking at you that something is really weighing on you. This was something that he could not carry on his shoulders anymore. And you could visibly see that this was the case with Hitson. His face was bright.
Where, with no words being spoken, you just knew things had turned.
Hitson stopped and asked if he could have a cigarette.
And he took a big old long drag of that cigarette, and then he said, okay, I'll tell you.
Hitson just drew a deep breath and sighed. And I recall him saying, you just try to live your life, and then somebody gets in your head. And then from there, he began to tell what had actually happened.
Hitson tells us that he shot Conway between his eyes, one single shot in the middle of the forehead.
One of the investigators said, well, would you be willing to go show us where the body parts were located, the head, hands, and feet?
He admitted, yes, I know where the parts are, and I can take you to the location.
I was ecstatic because that'd be 100% identification of Conway Utterbeck.
With a confession secured, detectives place Hitson under arrest, and he leads them to Conway's missing body parts near Pensacola.
He was restrained in handcuffs, belly chains, and several of us loaded up, and we drove out to I-10 in Santa Rosa County. We pull off this deserted exit ramp. Hitson's going, well, it's about right here. Okay, stop right here. We stop and get out. It was almost like he had a photographic memory.
He literally led us out in the woods and pointed, I think that the head is right there, and he would look around. The hands are over there, the feet are over there, and he was spot on.
Houston County, Georgia Sheriff's investigators are seen here with the suspect, Travis Hitson. Hitson is being extradited back to Houston County, where he faces murder charges.
Subsequent to locating the body parts, we conducted an autopsy.
They had a forensic odontologist examine dental x-rays of Conway Utterbeck, compare those with the teeth in the skull, and he made a positive identification. This was, in fact, Conway Utterbeck.
The Utterbecks were able to have Conway back. For them, that was very important to be able to bury their son.
When they brought what part of Conway's body they had back, we completed the funeral plans. Most of the neighborhood from everywhere around here were there. The church was pretty full. I pray for our family and for Conway.
With the victim's identity confirmed, the medical examiner works to verify Hitson's story and to determine Conway's cause of death.
There was actually a small projectile that was recovered intact in the back of that skull. Everything that Travis Hitson admitted to, we were able to verify. I shot him right here, and that's where the bullet hole was.
Detectives know how Conway died, but now the question becomes, why?
It's no longer who is the victim. It's no longer how did it occur. Now things begin to evolve into what are the degrees of culpability. What had happened in those hours between Vollmer and Hitson that resulted in this murder.
Travis Hitson has just confessed to killing Conway Utterbeck. Now investigators want to know why the homicide took place and if Ed Vollmer, a fellow sailor, had anything to do with the murder.
Hitson tells us that he thought he was going with his supervisor, with, Vollmer, to Vollmer's house for the weekend. Hitson doesn't know that Conway's going, and Conway doesn't know that Hitson's going, literally until they get to Vollmer's car. And they were both surprised that the other one was there. Vollmer and Hitson had gone out, but Utterbeck stayed behind at Vollmer's house. They had been drinking heavily, and while driving back, Vollmer started telling Hitson that Utterbeck actually had a, quote, hit list that they were both on. Vollmer stated, if we don't kill him first, he's going to kill us.
Vollmer started pumping him up, making him paranoid about walking into the house.
You put someone like Hitson, who takes the chain of command very seriously, and then you combine that with Ed Vollmer, who loved having someone to control. And at this point, he was scared. He was listening to his superior. When they got back to the house, Vollmer put on a bulletproof vest and a trench coat. He had a sawed-off shotgun and an aluminum baseball bat.
But he's telling Hitson to take a baseball bat and to go disable Utterbeck.
Hitson went into the house. Conway was asleep in the lazy boy chair. He did what Vollmer told him and hit Conway with the baseball bat and started dragging him to the kitchen. Vollmer didn't want it to take place on the parents' carpet because it would be too messy. Once they got him in, stopped him from struggling.
Utterbeck was screaming and asking Hitson, why? What have I ever done to you?
Vollmer grabbed a .22 pistol, handed it to Hitson, and said, shoot him. And Hitson shot him in the forehead. Vollmer then told him, we need to get rid of the evidence. Vollmer went out and got a hacksaw from the shed, hands it to Hitson, and tells him to start cutting off Conway's hand. And Hitson starts doing so, and he got sick. And continue. So Vollmer took the hacksaw and continued dismembering the body. They wrapped up the torso, put it in Vollmer's trunk, and drove a couple miles away to the wooded area and buried it in a shallow grave. We pressed about the genital mutilation that had been done to Conway.
Hitson seemed to be adamant that that was Vollmer, that he didn't do that.
We went and cleaned the house up afterwards all this was done.
Hitson spent hours cleaning the floor, cleaning furniture. They finally get it as clean as they can.
They put the head, the hands, and the feet in a plastic bag and put it in Vollmer's trunk, and actually drove back to Pensacola, to the ship, and went to work that day with the body parts still in Vollmer's trunk. After work, he and Vollmer took the body parts into another wooded area, and they had buried them there.
Investigators also asked Hitson about the sightings of Utterback's car around the base.
Hitson said that he did what Vollmer told him and moved Conway's car so it was seen at different locations than where it had last been parked.
In the end, Hitson claims he acted on directions from Ed Vollmer. He was manipulated into the plot by what he now knows were Vollmer's false threats about Conway's hit list.
You know, motive for this case has always been a little bit of a puzzle. Why Conway Utterback?
It's not like it was a spontaneous act, or crime of passion or anything like that. It was just unnecessary.
Certainly from Hitson's standpoint, he had been convinced that Utterback was out to get him and he had to strike first. But from Vollmer's standpoint, I don't know.
In order to find
Their interview with Hitson, investigators receive word that Vollmer has been spotted at his family's cabin.
That evening around 5 o'clock, Vollmer actually pulled into the driveway. Two of our investigators approached him as he was getting out of the car, advised him he was under arrest for the murder of Conway Utterback. And immediately he advised he was not making a statement at all and said he had nothing to say.
With Vollmer keeping quiet, detectives turned their attention to his parents' cabin.
We recovered a .22 handgun that belonged to Vollmer's father.
They also found the aluminum bat that was used to beat Conway, and that was in the shed, and they recovered the hacksaw from the shed as well.
Everything was matching. Everything was corroborating what Hitson had told us.
They used luminol in the kitchen.
It lit up. Clearly, there was blood.
While crime scene investigators continue to process the Vollmer home, detectives focus on Vollmer's car.
When we looked in the trunk, we looked at the spare tire, and that pattern that we had on Utterback's thigh, you saw it in the tread of that tire, and it was a perfect match. That also helped us put Utterback's body in the trunk of Vollmer's car.
Investigators believe they have enough forensic evidence to bring murder charges against Travis Hitson and Ed Vollmer. But why did a naval superior create the story of a fake hit list to convince his subordinate to murder another sailor?
Still missing from this whole crime was a clear motive.
Why would any human being do this? We certainly didn't have that answer yet.
Authorities have charged Ed Vollmer and Travis Hitson with the death of fellow sailor Conway Utterback. But with Vollmer, the driving force behind the murder, refusing to talk, investigators attempt to piece together a motive by speaking with those who knew the pair best.
We learned from fellow crewmates, Hitson was the perfect puppet for Vollmer. Ed Vollmer was in a position where, being the lead chief officer in this department, he was able to take advantage of people underneath him, people like Travis Hitson, and use his power and control to get him to do things that weren't appropriate, things like buy him cigarettes or go wash his car. He was just very degrading and belittling, especially with Travis Hitson. He definitely wanted Hitson to stand stand up to Vollmer, and in retaliation, Vollmer put Hitzen in a cage and locked him up there for several hours on the ship just to teach him a lesson.
Travis did everything in his power to please everyone. He did not want to disappoint anybody ever. Travis was very gullible. He would believe what you told him, even up into a fault. He certainly looked for the best in everybody, didn't think that anybody would lead him astray.
We also spoke with Ed Vollmer's ex-wife. During their marriage, he was abusive. She described several incidents where he beat her. She actually fled the state, didn't tell anyone where she was going because she was scared of Vollmer finding her and hurting her. Also, she said that Vollmer had this fascination with murder. He was reading books on murder, watching videotapes that depicted autopsies. We were putting together a motive of this was someone who had a fantasy of committing a murder, of getting away with a murder. Vollmer took sick pleasure in what he was doing, in the mutilation. He went way above and beyond getting rid of fingerprints. It was a thrill, we thought, for him.
And investigators believe that Conway was the perfect target for Vollmer's twisted fantasy.
There's no indication that Vollmer and Utterback were good friends. And all of a sudden, here he is inviting him to his home for the weekend.
Conway wanted to fit in as well, and Vollmer was his supervisor. I think that it made him feel special that Vollmer had invited him to his house for the weekend. Vollmer put thought into this. He strategized and got the three of them, the players that he wanted, his victim, Conway, and the person to carry it out for him, Travis Hitzen.
Vollmer knew when he left Pensacola what he had planned.
With a clear picture of the plot now in focus, prosecutors decide to try the gunman, Travis Hitzen, first.
In March of 1993, Travis Hitzen was convicted of the murder of Conway Utterback, and it sent a chill down my spine. He was sentenced to death.
Hitzen committed a horrible crime, but he was extremely remorseful. We didn't think that this would have happened if it weren't for Vollmer.
Travis and his family, that he had to pay that price. But in the same breath, it's a price that needed to be paid for Conway Utterback and his family.
Seeing one of the killers face to face was shocking. All I could think of was they wore the same uniform as Conway had. He respected his, but they didn't.
And after Hitzen was convicted of that death penalty, I think it finally sunk in with Vollmer that this is a done deal for me.
He pled guilty in order to avoid the death penalty.
Vollmer received his sentence. He's serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole.
It didn't seem fair. Vollmer, in our eyes, was more culpable and deserving of the death penalty than Hitzen. However, they didn't want to risk Vollmer walking, so they took his guilty plea.
In 2016, while Vollmer sits in prison awaiting his chance at parole, Travis Hitzen is executed by lethal injection.
I did get to visit Mr. Hitzen before they executed him. In our final moment, we said a prayer, and hopefully God will have forgiven him.
If I could say one thing to Conway right now, it would be, I love you, son. And I'm happy for you that you got to do what you wanted to do, because so many people don't get to do their dream.
Có lúc muốn biết em với anh là gì, chỉ là bản thân chơi với nhau không cần gì. là sao từng phút giây tình yêu nào có hay cứ đến với ta chẳng thể nào kịp nhận ra. Anh vẫn cứ nhớ nhung đến em hàng ngày. Em là tình yêu hay lẽ sống trên đời này. Nàng như là đóa hoa một thiên thần sứ, xa khiến cho ta ngất ngây không tìm được lối ra. Chẳng biết đến bao giờ nào đâu có anh ngờ tình yêu đã lỡ trao cho nhau. Người yêu mãi không rời đành cứ thế thôi người, sâu trong trái tim anh hằng mong ước muốn nói với em bao điều. Dù cho trời đổi thay em là người anh không thể thiếu, anh sẽ mãi mãi yêu em như vậy. Chỉ mong là chúng ta tình yêu sẽ đong đầy. Mỗi lần gặp em trên phố anh chẳng biết nói gì hơn. Em cứ xinh mà không cần phải cố. Ai cũng biết em là my girl, chẳng cần đau khổ mỗi khi âu sầu. Vì em đã có anh ở bên, những kỷ niệm mà vẫn giữ trong đầu. Anh luôn đặt nó ở trên, vì anh yêu em hơn tất cả. Dẫu cho sau này nắng mưa anh không bao giờ sợ vất vả. Dành cho em thì anh sẽ luôn dư thừa, bởi vì tình yêu ngọt như ly sữa trắng, cũng bị đắng như tách cà phê đến. Em cứ yên tâm không cần lo lắng, đã có anh mang đi hết ưu phiền. Nên là muốn nói với em bao điều. Dù cho trời đổi thay em là người anh không thể thiếu, anh sẽ mãi mãi yêu em như vậy. Chỉ mong là chúng ta tình yêu sẽ đong đầy. La 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 la. Và sau tất cả anh đã tự hỏi về tình cảm của chúng ta, bất chấp mọi thứ để đến với em, rồi cuối cùng anh đã có thể nói em là đây như thế đó anh sẽ yêu thật lòng. Sự thật là rất khó để thế giới luôn màu hồng, mặc cho ngàn khó khăn làm ta về cách ngàn nhưng vẫn mãi bên, chẳng bao giờ rời xa.